You? Oh! It's not possible!
It was supposed to be a luxury vacation in the Caribbean. More than 2,500 people sailing on the largest cruise ship in the region. But when the captain ignored all the warnings and struck the reef at 1:30 in the morning, water began flooding into the ship. 2,500 lives depended on a single decision, and that was when he saw something on the bridge that no one can explain. A miracle of the Virgin Mary that saved everyone on board. But before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. You know, that kind of person who never admits they're wrong? Who trusts themselves so much that they ignore any advice. Thomas Morrison was exactly that kind of man. 52 years old, 28 years sailing the world's oceans, captain of one of the largest luxury cruise ships in the Caribbean. The meeting room was silent that December morning. 6 officers around the mahogany table, steaming coffee cups, scattered documents, everyone waiting. Thomas walked in 10 minutes late. He didn't apologize. He never did. He sat at the head of the table, opened his laptop, and began checking weather reports without looking at anyone. The youngest officer, James, raised his hand hesitantly. "Captain, about the warning we received last night?" Thomas didn't lift his eyes from the screen. "What warning?" "The buoy marking the main reef was repositioned 3 days ago. The nautical charts we have on board may be outdated. I thought we should—" Thomas finally looked up, those cold blue eyes that made even experienced officers shrink back. "James, we have state-of-the-art GPS, a navigation system that costs more than your house. Continue." James opened his mouth to insist. Thomas's stare silenced him. He lowered his eyes to his papers. No one else spoke. Have you ever worked with someone like that? Someone so good at what they do that questioning them becomes impossible. After the meeting, Thomas went to his cabin, small but comfortable. Bed impeccably made, desk with laptop, neatly arranged papers, and a photo in a silver frame. Him, his wife Laura, and 2 girls, 8-year-old Chloe, 11-year-old Hannah, taken 3 years ago in a park, all smiling. A rare day when he was home. Thomas picked up the photo, ran his thumb over the glass over Laura's face. 15 years of marriage, 9 of them with Thomas at sea, away from home, building a career. Laura didn't complain anymore. That was the worst part. In the beginning, she asked him to be present, for the girls, for her. Now she only asked when he would return, and accepted any answer without arguing. Thomas put the photo away. He had a ship to command, 2,500 passengers depending on him. That was what mattered now. The luxury cruise ship was a floating city. 10 decks of cabins, restaurants, casino, pools, theater, families on vacation, couples on honeymoon, retirees living out dreams. Among the passengers was a woman most barely noticed, Margaret, 68 years old, a nun from the Franciscan order, traveling alone. She was small, thin, with deep wrinkles around gentle eyes. She wore a simple light brown habit without adornments, except for one thing, around her neck, a medal of the Virgin Mary. Old, worn by time, hanging from a thin silver chain. The medal had belonged to her mother. Margaret never took it off, not even to sleep. She spent most of her time in the ship's small chapel, a quiet space on the 3rd deck, rarely visited. Wooden benches for maybe 20 people, a simple crucifix on the wall, and a small image of the Virgin Mary in a niche. Margaret prayed there every morning and every night. The cruise route was simple, from one Caribbean island to another. Crystal blue waters, perfect sky, mild temperature, the kind of trip people save money for years to take. Everything was going perfectly. Until 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, when everything changed. An elderly passenger on the 5th deck began feeling chest pain, severe pain. He couldn't breathe properly, cold sweat. His wife called the infirmary in panic. The ship's medical team arrived in 3 minutes. Nurse, doctor. They checked his vital signs, asked questions. The man was having what seemed to be a serious heart attack. The ship's infirmary had good equipment, but it wasn't a hospital. They couldn't perform surgery. They couldn't handle major cardiac emergencies. The doctor called the bridge, spoke with the officer on duty, who immediately woke the captain. Thomas reached the bridge in less than 2 minutes, still buttoning his uniform shirt. He listened to the report, checked the ship's position on the digital map. How long until the next island on the route? 7 hours, Captain. Too long. What's the nearest island right now? The officer zoomed in on the map. There's an island with a hospital 2 hours from here, but to get there, we'd need to pass on the reef side. The normal route goes around the other side. 3 hours. Thomas studied the map. The reef was a long coral formation, dangerous for navigation. The safe route circled to the west, adding an extra hour of travel. But there was a channel on the eastern side, narrower, riskier, but faster. We're going through the east, Thomas decided. Prepare the course change. I'm taking command. The officer hesitated. Captain, the warning about the buoy. Thomas cut him off. All our instruments are working. We'll save an hour. This man may not have an hour. It made sense. It was logical, efficient. It was arrogant. Thomas took command personally, plotted the new course in the navigation system. Everything precise, everything calculated. The massive ship began turning slowly in the dark water, changing direction, heading toward the narrow channel beside the reef. It was 11:47 p.m. when Thomas walked down the third-deck corridor, going to check on the patient himself. He wanted to be sure they were doing the right thing, that the detour was necessary. That's when he saw light coming from the chapel. He stopped. The door was slightly open. For a second, for some reason he couldn't explain, he looked inside. Margaret was there, alone, kneeling on the first bench, head bowed, hands together, the Virgin Mary medal around her neck catching the candlelight, glowing softly. She prayed in a low voice. Words Thomas couldn't hear. But there was something in the way she prayed, intensity, urgency, as if she were asking for something very important. Thomas stood there for maybe 5 seconds, just watching, feeling something strange. A restlessness he couldn't name. Then he kept walking. There was work to be done, decisions to make. There was no time for superstition. The ship moved through the night, black water all around, a sky full of stars above. Most passengers were asleep, some in the casino, others in the bars, the normal rhythm of a cruise. No one knew the course had changed. No one knew about the danger approaching. At 12:15, the patient had been stabilized enough to be transferred. A smaller boat was prepared. The doctor and the nurse would take the man to the island, to the hospital. His wife would go with him. The boat was lowered into the sea, engine on. It headed toward the distant lights of the coast. The ship waited, engines idling, drifting gently in the current. Thomas was on the bridge watching the boat move away, feeling satisfied. They had done the right thing, acted quickly, probably saved a life. At 0040, the boat signaled that it had reached the hospital safely. The doctor and nurse would return in an hour. Thomas ordered the ship to remain in position, waiting. The bridge was quiet. Only the low hum of the instruments, red panel lights. 2 officers on duty checking systems. Thomas sat in the captain's chair, looked out the large window into the darkness outside. He could see the island's lights in the distance, stars reflecting on the calm water. Everything was under control. Or so he thought. Have you ever had that moment when everything seems fine, but something inside you says it's not? That feeling that something is wrong, but you can't identify what? Thomas felt that. For just a second. An inexplicable chill down his spine, as if someone had opened a door, letting cold air in. He turned, looked around the bridge. Nothing. Just the officers working. Everything normal. He shook his head. Tiredness, probably. It had been a long day. At 01:25, the doctor and nurse returned to the ship. They were lifted aboard with the boat. Everything went well. "Prepare to resume the journey," Thomas ordered. "We're heading to the next island according to the itinerary." But not by the original route. They were already positioned for the Eastern Channel. Passing along the side of the reef, the fastest path back to course, he handed command to his second officer, Anderson, less experienced but competent. He needed to do this eventually, let the team take command. "Anderson, what's our distance to the buoy that marks the reef?" Anderson checked the radar, consulted the navigation system. "3 cables, Captain. We're safe." Except the buoy wasn't where the system said it was. But Thomas didn't know that, and Anderson didn't know that. "Good. Maintain course. I'll rest briefly in my cabin. Call me if there's any change." Thomas left the bridge. It was the worst decision he made in 28 years of his career. In the cabin, he took off his shoes. He lay down on the bed without taking off his uniform. He would only close his eyes for 15 minutes, just to rest. But something bothered him. That strange feeling returned, stronger now. He looked up at the dark ceiling, tried to identify what it was. Worry about the patient? No, he was safe now in the hospital. Worry about the route? No, they had all the instruments working. It was something else. Thomas closed his eyes. On the command bridge, Anderson was doing his job conscientiously, checking instruments, monitoring the radar. Then his phone rang, internal call, a passenger on the 7th deck complaining about noise coming from the cabin next door. A party after midnight. Anderson promised to send someone to check. Wrote down the cabin number. It was only 10 seconds of distraction, but 10 seconds in which he did not look at the radar. When he returned his attention, the illuminated buoy of the reef was much closer than it should have been, visible through the bridge window. His blood froze. "Turn left! Turn now!" he shouted to the helmsman. The helmsman turned the wheel. The giant ship began to respond. Slowly, very slowly. Ships of that size don't turn like cars. They need time, space. And they had neither time nor space. At 1:30 a.m., Thomas was almost asleep when he heard the sound. A horrible screech of metal being torn apart, coming from somewhere deep in the ship's hull, like giant nails scraping a chalkboard. The entire ship shook. Thomas was thrown from the bed. He fell to the floor. Alarms began to blare, red emergency lights flashing. He got up, ran to the door, climbed the stairs to the command bridge. When he arrived, Anderson was pale as paper, hands trembling over the controls. "Captain, we hit the reef?" Thomas looked at the instruments. 3 hull compartments showed red alarm. Water entering. Fast. "Close all watertight doors now," Thomas shouted. Heavy metal doors closing automatically throughout the ship, sealing compartments. But the water was already coming in, thousands of liters per minute. Thomas grabbed the map, checked the position, calculated options. They couldn't continue to the next island. Water coming in too fast. They would sink before arriving. They couldn't evacuate there. Middle of the ocean. Dark night. Impossible to rescue 2,357 people safely. Officers shouted reports. Water rising in compartment 3. List increasing. Thomas looked at the maps, hands trembling, sweat running down his face. For the first time in 28 years, in thousands of hours at sea, in hundreds of difficult situations, he didn't know what to do. "Captain," the duty officer shouted, "we need a decision now." Thomas opened his mouth. No words came out. His mind was blank, completely paralyzed. 2,557 people depending on him, and he had no answer. That was when it happened. Thomas was staring at the window of the command bridge, trying to see something outside in the darkness, trying to find some kind of answer in the black water. And then he felt it. A scent. Roses, strong, unmistakable, impossible, in the middle of the ocean. Roses. Thomas snapped his head around. "Do you smell that?" The officers looked at him confused. "Smell what, Captain?" They didn't smell it, only he did. A light began to appear, soft, silvery blue, reflecting on the dark glass of the bridge window. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. Thomas turned, and she was there, 2 meters away from him, real, solid, present, wearing a deep blue mantle that seemed to capture and reflect its own light, as if thousands of stars had been woven into the fabric. A white tunic underneath shining softly. But it was the face that made Thomas forget to breathe. Young, but with eyes that carried the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes, eyes that were looking directly at him. And there was something in those eyes. Compassion, pure, absolute, unconditional. There was no judgment there, no condemnation for his mistakes, no anger at his arrogance, only love. The kind of love Thomas had never felt, not from his parents, not from Laura. A love that saw everything he was, every flaw, every pride, every failure, and loved him anyway. Thomas couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare. Around him, the officers kept working, shouting, running, checking panels. None of them saw her. Only he did. The woman, and Thomas knew who she was, knew it with every fiber of his being, even though he had never believed, even though he had mocked it. She raised her right hand, slowly, with a grace impossible to describe. She extended her arm, pointed, to the left side of the command bridge, through the window, into the darkness outside, specific direction. Precise! And Thomas felt something inside him. It wasn't thought, it wasn't logic, it was certainty. He knew. He turned his head, followed the exact direction she pointed. At first he saw nothing, only darkness, black water. But then his eyes adjusted, and he could see distant lights from the coast, and between the ship and the coast, an area of lighter water, shallower water, a sandbank, large, flat, perfect. The only place within 50 kilometers where they could run aground safely, where the depth was exactly right, where they would have access for evacuation. How did she know? Thomas looked back at her. The Virgin Mary, because that was who she was. He no longer had any doubt. She was still there. But now she was looking directly at him. Those eyes met his, and Thomas understood without words. You can do this. Now you need courage. She tilted her head, slightly, gently, motherly, like a mother encouraging a frightened child. And then the light began to fade and disappeared. The smell of roses remained for a few more seconds. Then it too was gone. Thomas stood there, heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Captain!" the officer shouted again. "We need a decision now." Thomas blinked, took a deep breath, turned to the chart table. His hands no longer trembled. He found the exact spot on the map. Perfect, impossible to have seen without help, but perfect. "We'll ground her here," he pointed on the map, voice steady, without hesitation. The officer looked. "Captain, how do you know—" "Prepare for intentional grounding. Reduce speed to 5 knots. Approach angle 15 degrees east. Execute now." There was something in Thomas's absolute command tone, something that allowed no questioning. Everyone obeyed immediately. Thomas took control, guiding the massive ship through the dark water, straight to where she had pointed. The ship approached the sandbank, speed reduced, perfect angle. At 0150, exactly 20 minutes after the initial impact, the ship touched bottom. Gently, he slid onto the sand, stopped, tilted only slightly, stable, secure, perfect for evacuation. The officers looked at one another, astonished. How had the captain known? How had he found that exact spot in the darkness? But there was no time for questions. "Sound the evacuation alarm," Thomas ordered. "Prepare all the lifeboats. Start with the elderly and children. Standard procedure." The evacuation began. At O2 Sequoia, the first lifeboat was launched safely, then another, and another. The procedure they had rehearsed dozens of times in training was now real, but the crew was prepared. Passengers were guided to lifeboat stations, dressed in life jackets, reassured by the calm crew. There was some panic, some children crying, some adults in shock, but there was no chaos. Thomas was calm now, focused, decisive, as if he knew everything was going to be all right. Because she had shown the way. Rescue boats from the island began to arrive, coast guards, private vessels, everyone helping. At 03:30, half of the passengers had been evacuated. At 05:19, the last passenger stepped safely into a boat. 2,557 people. 0 losses, 0 serious injuries, some scratches, some bruises, many people in shock, many traumatized, but all alive, all saved. Statistically, it was impossible. Evacuations of ships of that size, especially at night, especially with panic, always resulted in fatalities. Always, but not this time. Thomas was the last to leave the ship, as duty required. He walked through the empty bridge. Silent now, he went to the exact place where she had stood, looked at that empty space, touched the air with his hand, as if he could still feel something of her there. "Thank you," he whispered. His voice broke. And for the first time since he was a small child, since before he learned that men don't cry, since before he built all those walls of competence and control, Thomas Morrison cried, not silent tears rolling down his face, deep sobs that shook his entire body, sounds coming from a place inside him that had been sealed for decades. He cried for his arrogance, for every time he ignored warnings, for thinking he knew more than everyone else. He cried for Laura, for Chloe and Hannah, for every dinner he missed, every birthday, every school performance. He cried for almost sinking a ship with 2,557 people because of pride, and he cried out of gratitude, because even without deserving it, even after mocking faith, even after being arrogant and foolish, she had come. She had saved everyone through him. Thomas stood there for maybe 5 minutes. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand, straightened his uniform, and left the command bridge for the last time. The investigation took 6 months. The conclusion was inevitable, human error, outdated nautical charts that had not been properly verified, excessive dependence on a single navigation system. Captain Thomas Morrison, directly responsible. Navigation license permanently revoked. Thomas could have fought. He could have hired lawyers. He could have appealed. He did not fight. "You're right," he said. "I was arrogant. I ignored warnings. I put lives at risk out of pride. I deserve to lose my license." It was the first time in 6 months that he slept well that night. Thomas went back home, a home where he had a room, but not a life, a home where he was a visitor, not a resident. Except this time it was different. Laura was waiting at the door when he arrived. She looked at him. "You're different," she said. "I am," he replied. The girls ran out. "Daddy, Daddy." And Thomas knelt there in the doorway and hugged his daughters, hugged them for real. As if they were the most precious thing in the universe, because they were. The first months were hard. Thomas had savings, but they weren't infinite. He looked for work. He discovered that a captain without a license wasn't useful for much on land. He finally got a position as a port operations manager, office job, coordinating arrivals and departures, paperwork, business hours. It paid a third of what he earned as a captain, but he came home every day at 5:30. In time for dinner with the family, he helped with homework, he went to school performances, he took the girls to the park on Saturdays. Small things, simple things, things he had missed for 15 years. 6 months after the accident, Thomas began doing something he had never done in his adult life. Every Sunday morning he went to a small church near home. Laura was Catholic, raised in the faith. But she had stopped going to Mass when the girls were little, when it became clear that Thomas would never go with her. Now she looked at him in surprise when he said he wanted to go. The first Mass was strange. Thomas didn't know when to stand, when to sit, when to kneel. He didn't know the responses everyone recited, but he tried, and he went back the next week, and the next. One day he walked to the front. There was a statue of the Virgin Mary in a niche beside the altar. Those eyes full of compassion. Thomas knelt before the statue. He felt ridiculous, but he stayed. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I never learned how to truly pray. I never believed. But I saw you. I know you're real. And His voice broke. "I lost everything. My career, my reputation, everything I built in 28 years. Tears beginning to fall. But I saved 2,057 people. And I have my family. And for the first time in years, I'm truly happy." He wiped his face with his sleeve. "So, thank you. Thank you for coming when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for saving everyone. Thank you for saving me too." But Thomas stayed there on his knees for 10 more minutes, in silence, in peace, for the first time in his life. He had lost everything and gained everything. Before finishing, I want to invite you to join our prayer community for the Virgin Mary, a space of faith and hope where people from all over the world come together to pray and share the graces they've received. If you feel in your heart the desire to be part of this prayer chain, click below and become a member of the channel today and come pray with us. And listen, if you made it all the way here to the end of Captain Thomas's story, do one thing for me. Write in the comments "Sandbank," the exact place the Virgin Mary pointed to on that bridge. I want to see how many hearts this story has truly reached. And every time I read "Sandbank" in the comments, I will know that one more person believes that the miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs their hope renewed today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.